we spoke to you about the potential impact on India of the US tax reform that is currently underway. Remember that the two bills are being reconciled and we should have a final bill signed by President Donald Trump by the end of this year. So why are we examining this? Because I think some of the changes will have impact on how US corporations invest in other countries, and I think that is critical to be able to understand whether it will impact, let's say, emerging markets like India and the foreign investments coming in. To talk about that, we are joined today by Maulik Doshi. He's partner at SKP Consulting. Maulik's written a detailed analytical article on Bloomberg Queen, so I urge you to go visit that if you want some more background. And also joining us this morning, Rupak Saha, tax partner at PwC. Mr. Saha has also been tax head at General Electric India, so he has a very good idea of how important a role tax plays when determining foreign investments in countries like India. I'm going to sort of compress, Maulik, the key takeaways from your article and your analysis into 3 quick points. One is that the reduction in the headline tax rate of US corporate tax from 35 to 21% will make it more sort of attractive for US corporations to make profits in the US, could impact transfer pricing policies or how they remunerate Indian subsidiaries. That's point number one. The point number two that you made was the move to a territorial system of taxation. Effectively, this means that there is no incentive anymore for US corporations in retaining profits overseas, because they now get to bring those profits back into the US in an almost tax-free fashion, except for a one-time tax. And the third one was this 20% excise tax that you've spoken of in the article, where you've said that this will apply on payments made by US corporations to their subsidiaries elsewhere in the world. And effectively what this does is potentially increases the cost of outsourcing by a US corporation, right? All three put together, is it your assessment that this could substantially change the way Indian subsidiaries of US MNCs, sort of behave financially, the way they invest in India?
Yeah, I think so. It would kind of have a substantial impact on the way Indian subsidiaries, or for that matter, any other country in the world, they behave. US multinationals would now kind of try and put more profits and more income back in USA. Because of the tax litigation in India, sometimes the companies were conservative and kind of having more markup, more profits in India. There is no incentive further to do that. In fact, they will be kind of much more beneficial keeping more profits in US rather than keeping it in India. In fact, outsourcing or contract manufacturing or pharma R&D activities that take place in India is going to get more costlier with this kind of a thing. The final thing on the excise tax is still not out. So the House committee and the Senate committee were completely apart in terms of how the overseas payments would be taxed. But once we have a final word on that, we can kind of really analyze and really see how it is going to impact the overseas payments.
Okay, fair enough. And just a quick sort of alert to our viewers that these are potential changes. Yeah. We're still waiting for the final bill, so this is still nothing speculative. I think most of these details are already in, but there could be some finishing touches that apply that could change the way some of these are interpreted. This headline tax rate coming down to 21%. In India, the headline tax rate is 35%, but the effective tax rate, the finance ministry has told us, is roughly around 22%. So does this make a big difference? Will other countries look at the US and say, hey, if we don't reduce our headline corporate tax rate, we're going to lose investments in our country?
Sure, I think it's going to make a huge difference. I think the economies will compete for the headline tax rate, for the reducing the tax rate. Our finance minister has promised for kind of 4 years back that he is going to bring down the tax rate to 25%.
We're not sure we have the fiscal space to do that
absolutely.
This year.
And then we're still kind of a very small population of the corporates pay 25% tax rate, yet we are 33% tax rate. So it's definitely going to prompt all the economies to relook at their tax policies and tax structures and see if they can bring down the tax rates to somewhere competitive than the current one. And like you mentioned, the fiscal balance needs to be maintained, so I don't know how India is going to react. Already there are news like the finance secretary has asked for reactions from the industry, feedback from the industry in terms of how do they move forward to kind of affect the change towards the US tax reform. So it's going to be a race to the bottom, I think so.
Okay, I want you, Maulik, to think about the kind of structures and the kind of industries that get impacted the most because of this. But before I come to you on that, I want to go to Rupak Saha because he understands the balance between tax and market opportunity. Mr. Saha, what do you make of these potential changes in the US tax code, and how do you think it will impact how large MNCs invest in other countries in the world?
Yeah, my take is that I think people need to be more circumspect. My take is I think the tax profession and the media is getting perhaps ahead of the curve over here.
Okay.
A lot would depend upon which version of the bill and how do they reconcile with each other. With due respect, I'm not necessarily immediately aligned with Maulik that outsourcing costs will jump up. Partly because unlike the earlier border tax, now this excise tax is, or even for that matter, the Senate version, I think is applicable only with respect to related party payments. The earlier version of border tax, was impacting even unrelated party payments. That's point number one. Even in the context of the border tax, let me also point out that there is a provision of deemed foreign tax credit. So, for example, if any payment which is being made to an Indian related party, while that is subject to a US tax of 20%, but against that 20%, if the Indian related party opts for what they call for an effective connected income option, by which the 20% will be on a net income basis, and against that net income basis you would get a deemed foreign credit of 80% of the foreign tax. So if the Indian tax rate is anywhere over 25% on those payments, then there is actually no excise tax back in the US. So as long as India's tax rate is more than 25% on those payments, under the House version, there should not be actually any residual tax. So I don't think we should jump to conclusion immediately. I think we need to see how the whole legislation evolves. I think I would
Mr.
rather
Saha,
wait and watch.
No, those points are well taken. And I think, as Maulik pointed out, that one issue of 20% excise tax is still contentious. We don't know how to fully interpret it. But, how do you read the broad thrust of this US tax code? And the broad thrust is this: US corporations should invest in the US. US corporations should bring their overseas profits back to the US. That seems to be the broad thrust. And while we understand that from a US growth perspective, we've got to try and understand whether it could have any impact on foreign investment in India, especially by US corporations. What's your assessment on that?
Again, I mean, look, whatever I have seen, I don't think there is a general feel that yes, because of protectionist policies in the US, or because of the economy getting incented by the current Trump administration in the US, businesses have looked more inwards, US businesses have looked more inwards and seen what more they can do in the US. But I personally think that would impact perhaps, jurisdictions such as Singapore, such as other low tax jurisdictions which were actually, I think, getting disproportionate share of US investments compared to their markets. But where there are deep, stable markets like India, I'm not too sure whether this would make a day, day and night difference to investment into the country. I refuse to buy that.
Yeah, no, that's a point well taken. I mean, I don't think companies make decisions only based on tax rates or tax treatment. You make decisions based on the market opportunity. But Maulik, certain structures will change. Do you see, and I don't want to get into the technicalities of structures at this point in the morning, but do you see certain industries being impacted more than others? You spoke of outsourcing. Right. When that gets finalized, if it does get finalized the way you understand it, do you see, for instance, pharma outsourcing? Yes. Or even the big KPOs or BPOs in India that some of these large US companies have? Will those things potentially change or get impacted according to you?
Yeah, absolutely, because I still see that if there is this excise tax or whatever B tax that they call it in USA, if industry is operating out of an SEZ unit in India, they don't pay any taxes here in India essentially, apart from the MAT. So the overall tax cost is going to rise for these companies. So be it pharma outsourcing the R&D centers that are there, all contract manufacturing companies which are kind of outsourcing the work here, ITCS space, the entire thing is going to get affected. So those are the top three industry that's definitely going to get impacted.
So ITES, pharmaceutical and all contract manufacturing.
Absolutely. Other thing is from an Indian outbound perspective, Indian multinationals operating in USA.
Yeah, that's the other one, right? Indian IT companies setting up businesses in the US.
So till now how the mechanics is working is the Indian IT company having a subsidiary in USA always would treat US company as a kind of a cost plus entity, remunerating with them a very small markup. Now with this dynamics, I'm sure the Indian multinationals also would want to park their profits in US rather than bringing it back to India and tax it in India. So the transfer pricing dynamics in those scenarios, in those models also would change. So it's definitely going to get an impact on the India-US tax trade and the investments.
Okay. Mr. Saha, how would you react to the fact that while we understand that this will not have an overwhelming impact on investment decisions, certain structures, certain industries might be more impacted than others? In your assessment, which ones could they be?
That I think I'm aligned with what Maulik just said. So you know, the IT, ITES industry, particularly those, I think, as he said, in the SEZs or tax incented regions, those would get potentially impacted because they do not have any local taxes over here. I think also what I would say is that instead of sort of identifying which exact other industry sectors which would get impacted, but I think with respect to India outbounds, given the way they are funded, they are structured, that may get somewhat impacted because of the interest limitation rules which has been introduced. So until now, I think pushing leverage or debt leverage down into US operations and getting a deduction for those has been a major a strategy for investors into the US. That, I think, with the interest limitation rule will get impacted, and how you deploy capital in the US and whether there is a need to restructure that needs to be looked at. So some of those restructures at the US end by India outbound businesses, I think, will come to the fray.
All right, gentlemen, I know there's so much more to be said on this, but I think we'll hold that for till when the bill is finalized into a law and signed by President Trump, and come back to you, Mr. Saha, and to you, Maulik, for more analysis and more extensive analysis at that point in time. This was not to alarm any investors, but just to give them an idea that structures could change, financials could get impacted in some ways, but large investment decisions, I don't think, as both our guests have pointed out, will change just on the basis of this. So it isn't as if FDI flow will suddenly stop coming to India or reduce, but yeah, you have to be alert to some of these things because they do end up changing how financials are calculated and things like that. So.
Yeah, but well, thanks so much, gentlemen, both of you, for joining in today and giving us your perspectives.